Hey Mel, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. How's it going?
Pretty good. How's your day going?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I'm having one of those random solopreneur kind of days where I'm doing all sorts of eclectic, weird, but kind of fun and interesting things. So I've just recorded a video on how to stretch your own diaphragm.
Oh,
And then I was having a consultation with someone doing a remote functional neurology consultation for me as patient. So that was quite fun
are
as well.
your brain
And
up?
hey,
Maybe your brain's all tuned up?
it is not currently tuned up, but we will get it there.
Yeah. And together maybe we have one brain as always.
Together we have one brain. I've got the maybe also together we have one vestibular system. Who knows? So that's my current area of focus is getting my left vestibular system to fire, if it would be so kind. So
It's so interesting to do a project based life or a solo entrepreneurship based life than rather than going to work in a place where everything's secure for you. It's nerve wracking and beautiful, but it lends itself to that idea of the artistic life, that your life is a work in project progress, and that's one of your biggest gifts, and you can change it and alter it. And yeah, but it's a little nerve wracking sometimes.
it can be a little nerve-wracking too, and it's good. It's like it's fun to be doing different things, but then also, landing. But speaking of projects, I had a very exciting delivery yesterday from China. I don't know if you got one of these.
Oh, I didn't send them my phone number yet, but maybe it'll come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with this, I'm holding up, the latest edition of the Chinese Medicine and Culture Journal, and both of us, Dr. Neal and myself, had, articles published in this along with some very, illustrious colleagues, so that was quite great, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was an honor to be included in that group of people. Yeah.
Yeah, so for, folks who are listening, it's worth checking out, and I do believe I don't wanna, speak out of turn, I do believe that you can download this for free online, but there's contributions from the likes of Ted Kaptchuk, Peter Denman, William Morris, Nigel Wiseman, John MacDonald, Judy James, Felicity Moir, Peter Ekman, and, the 2 of us. So, definitely it was an opportunity for, um, folks, I was gonna say, like, kind of luminaries and trailblazers in the West, plus me, to contribute, to a journal and really to help familiarize the Chinese with people who, for acupuncturists, are household names, but for them, they've never heard of any of us.
Maybe it was a little sobering, no, I think, when they reached out to us and they said we wanted to capture the voices of the luminaries in the field before they're gone. I was, wow,
Did
we're in that phase of life.
did did they know something that we don't?
Mhm. Yeah, but that was nice. So what's been on your mind this week?
Well, I feel like, a lot of things have passed my mind. I'm at the moment, I'm doing quite a deep dive on functional neurology, and whenever I'm studying any area, it's always with reference to what I'm learning about the Neijing. Because for me, the models that and the understandings and the patterns that are described in the Neijing are kind of like the big map, you know? They're the bigger map that you can then take these other fields, which may be very comprehensive in their own right, and they are actually. The field of functional neurology is huge, so I'm only looking at what I'm looking at, but even that is very comprehensive. But I can put it in the context of the patterns of motion, of the directions of motion, of how, life develops, and I feel like it gives me a little bit of an unfair advantage and a little bit of a head start, in my learning, but it's very enjoyable, and, I'm always thinking about how does this relate anatomically to where the watersheds are?
Yeah, isn't it amazing that aging kind of gives you the map of the universe and the code, gives you the code and then and it is a very basic way of seeing things that you can extrapolate to all these different things. Mhm.
Mm,
That's one of the things when we train people and there's the short and long learning parts. The short ones are things you can say and they get it. The long ones are things you have to chew on for a long time. And one is that reduction of everything into the map of the Neijing's model of the cosmos. But it seems applicable to everything. I keep my eyes. here, like keep looking in, quantum mechanic research and other things. Where does the model break down? And I haven't seen it yet. And it's
Mm.
also interesting. It's not a 90% model. They don't say 90% of the model of the universe fits this map. They say 100%. So like if it ever breaks anywhere, that's kind of big news, but I haven't found it yet.
Well, I haven't been trying, to break it as long as you have, but it definitely works, and, when I study the Western sciences, there's a lot of reductionism, and there's a lot of naming of parts, and one thing I've found is that if you learn things that way, it means that you can learn what you need to learn to pass the test without really understanding how something works.
Mm.
Whereas if you start with the maps of the universal patterns of the universe, um, then you understand how things work in general, and then you start to work with it that way, and it can well, it's interesting. I mean, it can help with problem solving. It can help you apply things more quickly. One example of this recently in my own self, and then applying it to practice, is with functional neurology. I use this brain stimulator thing, which is quite cool. I've been looking at the literature on that, and there's a lot of research on this. It's fantastic. It's really apparently the pioneers that was using this approach actually used just like a 9-volt battery, and then they would just use that to zap their brain, and I'm sure there's lots of stories I've never even heard about those, early attempts, but just this little device. It's not super expensive, and the way I was being instructed to use it was, on my frontal lobes and getting, the kind of sleepier right side to become a little more active and the left side to calm down a little bit, to bring me into a little bit more balance, but it occurred to me as I was studying neurology and with my understanding, that I'm gaining, from learning from you, and learning in Neijing is that the way things on Earth develop, in these, we talked a little bit last time, didn't we, about the Jing patterns of having like a center spine kind of, um, long long bit, and then things growing off of it. And that's exactly how the nervous system develops, like a tree, that it comes from a root and it grows up, and it differentiates and then it integrates. And so I thought, well, rather than stick it up here, if I have things that are not working so well back here, which is like kind of earlier, what happens if I stick this bad boy lower down and I've had this massive change from doing that I wasn't experiencing. And so it's exciting because the people who were instructing me are very smart and they've been doing this for a very long time, but it allowed me to kind of generate this hypothesis, this understanding of the general patterns, and based on what this person was teaching me, I thought, "Well, what if we stick it here?" So it wasn't a random guess, it was an informed guess or an informed, hypothesis, and then it turned out that it had really positive effect, and I've started using that with patients and seeing similar things.
That's so interesting. And it goes, we see ideas that seem simple, like, oh, a tree grows from a root and it goes into a branch, of course. And then we look deeper to this Neijing cosmology and we say, oh, that's not actually just a tree. It's actually the way the universe operates and how it moves, that every motion that creates the universe arises out of a root and moves out into an expression and returns back to some form of a root. And then that's a basic way that the universe is organized. And then it becomes much bigger. And then you can apply that to things in your life. For example, to stay in right relationship with the world, we think about staying in right relationship to our roots. So instead of reaching out for the branches, what fruit can I pick? We tend to the roots, and then nature makes the fruit. What are our roots in life? There are our family is a root, our teachers are a root, our past is a root, nature is a root, the cosmos is a root. And so and I talked about this before, I think that since the Industrial Revolution times where our tools got so good and then our time shifted 180 degrees so that we started to see our root is in our future, so that we discard the past and we say, well, what's going to sustain us is what we're going to discover. It's like that with climate change a little bit too. But it gives us a kind of vertigo on time, what I call time sickness, which
Mhm.
we reversed how the universe operate. So we can still make, there's things in our future to discover for sure. But if we start from our root of where we came from, the world appears to us much differently and we move through it in a different way. So that's an idea like, oh, that's a simple idea. You look out the window and you see a tree has a root, and then you go, well, actually, that's a much bigger idea.
It's huge, and it offers a really helpful, simplification, because then you start there and you ask that question, and, and I think about these things a lot in terms of w in lots of places, people need more nuance, and other places, people need more simplicity, and a lot of confusion comes
Right.
from everything, like, all this information being kind of flat, and people don't know where to focus, but by asking that question, and if you start at the root, it doesn't necessarily mean that's always where the problem is. You just kinda ask the question, and if it's fine, then you can keep going on to the next thing, although often it's not fine, and then you have some work
Right.
to do there.
And in Chinese medicine, for example, people often talk about root and branch treatments or diagnosis without maybe fully understanding what that means. But that means every illness arises out of an impairment of breath, and you can either treat the root of that impaired breath or its branch expression. And actually, we treat both. So, for example, someone has an acute problem, we might treat more of the branch expression, or we might treat more of the root, or it might be a blend. Or for example, where you put the electrodes with your brain stimulator, of course, you're going to start with the back of your head because that's the root of the brain. And so, of course, you would do that. But people who've been in the field forever, they wouldn't see that necessarily. Yeah.
Right. I suppose it gives you a lens. People talk about how it's helpful to have beginner's mind, but then when you become a specialist in an area, that's really difficult to do. But this seems almost like a map that can help you maintain that in I would say, like in a realistic way that you can be an expert, but by continuously going back, it still gives you that beginner's mind.
Yeah. And we often say like that the Neijing is actually pretty advanced in terms of its sophistication, but you should be able to describe its principles to a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old child. There's sometimes a lot of technical information and detail about that, but the basic thing, you should be able to explain to a child. And, everything I do, whether it's cancer treatments, research, environmental toxicology, whatever it is, I always start with the idea that the universe is a breath moving in and out of different shapes and forms, dimension. And then I start from there, and then I look at what I'm seeing, and I tie it together through that whole thing about root branch progression. And it's a code that makes sense of the universe in a way that looking at all its different parts doesn't always.
It's funny, when I first trained, 10, 12, 14 years ago, I was very interested in being able to explain what I learned in Chinese medicine in a way that patients and doctors and other people could understand. And so I did a lot of translating across to biochemistry and to physiology and that sort of thing. And for certain patients that works well. Uh, I think and that sort of thing. But now with these models, it's much easier to explain. I think because I understand it better. And it doesn't require all of this advanced, terminology and biochemistry. Although if you're speaking to someone who needs that, you can always use that. But yeah, it's made it a lot easier to explain.
We always speak to people where they're at for sure, and use their language and understanding. But it's when I'm talking to patients, it almost feels as if I'm talking to their cells or their body, which is listening. And when you say something like, the universe is the breath and blah, 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 and, this is why your illness happened, we think, then it's like their body goes, yes, finally someone actually understands like what's happening. Um, and it kind of the body listening sometimes it feels like, and they go, yeah, that makes sense to me.
That makes a lot of sense 'cause, uh, previously I studied clinical hypnosis, and so that's, using a lot of storytelling and metaphor in service of healing, which is extraordinarily powerful and is, used everywhere, although often it's used almost as like a nocebo. That there's a lot of storytelling that makes people sicker or keeps people sick. But we were taught to use you can use universal metaphors and you can use scripts and you can take things out of what the person has said and what their interests are. And so what always strikes me is that this is not to say that this is necessarily a way of communicating that's going to work for 100% of people, but because it's so universal, because you're getting to the core of nature, it's like the ultimate in um, healing through telling healthier stories, which you talk a lot about a lot.
These stories are everything about how we navigate the world. And a big part of our healthcare journey with people is to help them retell the stories about themselves. And retelling the story doesn't mean lying about something or making up a fairy tale or not basing it on science. It means rearranging things to tell a different story. And, most patients, when they come into our clinics, they have the mechanical story of healthcare, which came out of the Industrial Revolution too, which is your body is a machine and it has parts and parts break down and illnesses resides in the things and not in the patterns, but we look for problems with things and then we try and kind of hammer them back into shape or whatever. And that's one model. And different stories, they're not bad. They have pros and cons. But one of the main limitations we have now is we confuse stories with reality. Like if you ask someone about that model, they won't say, that's not a story. That's the way the body is. It's made up of cells and they break. But we have so many ways. Once you understand the story and make that shift to live in a story-based world, then it's not, you don't just can have one story. You can have 100 stories, and you use the different story in different ways due to their strengths and weaknesses. But the mechanical story, for example, is good if you're like replacing someone's hip. It's good to know about the thing. But it doesn't really resonate deeply into the way we feel about our lives or how we move through life with our health issues. When we retell the story to say, well, actually, there's another story, and it's that you are nature and that you are an expression of coherence, of breath. And that changes so many things in a person's life. And stories are magical because they change things instantaneously throughout a field when you retell the story. So a lot of what we do in healthcare is help our patients retell stories. That's a very simple role.
Another piece of that, which I think it's important to point out, at least from my perspective, and I think also can act as a bridge for people. If someone's their system is like open and ready, and they're kind of hungry for a new story, and they hear one that really resonates, and they might be able to make that shift. But for some people, there's a lot of safety in staying in the familiar and with that mechanical story that's often used in places that's not necessarily appropriate. But what I found is that it's not just that that's a story and it's fine in certain contexts. It's often not true even within its own assumptions. So, for example, a lot of people are told that there's problems with their cholesterol and that if it's a certain number that it needs to be lowered in order to prevent a heart attack. But then, when you go into the literature, there's a systematic review that shows that actually having higher LDL, which is usually called the bad cholesterol, is actually associated with greater survivability, and that lower LDL is associated with greater all-cause mortality. So there's a problem. So on the one hand, there's a problem that people don't realize that these are just stories, but on the other hand, is the story falls down within itself. You don't need to even start looking at nature or start looking at psychology or spirit. You don't even need to kind of bring anything else. It's like the story doesn't hang together even within its own assumptions or its own rules when you start looking. And I think that for many for many people is like an important thing to understand so that they're like, "Okay, then what are we looking at? Where's the better story? What is actually true?" And then people can transition over if they're ready.
That is so true. And in Western medicine, as you know, when you peek behind the curtain of science, and I'm a full-on science fan, by the way. I'm not a negative science person, but I love science. It's great. But when you peek behind the curtain of Western medicine, and people have done this, and say, how many of our practices are actually based on robust scientific studies? It's dismally low. It's dismally low. It's like 15, 20%, something in there.
It's lower than that. According to a review of Cochrane reviews, they found that
Or-
5% were based on quality literature.
I give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe we got better since then, which was a while ago, that study. But It's dismally low. Here's what I've learned about stories is that because we don't think about ourselves as story-based creatures, but we identify the story with our personal identity. Like when I tell the story of my culture, I don't feel like I'm telling a story. I feel like I'm telling about who I am, period. And that's why when you challenge people on their stories, it can be very difficult because you're not challenging the story, you're challenging them. And stories are required for us to have an identity as we move through the world. And without that, we're very lost. So sometimes I think of stories as like you're on a little island in the middle of the ocean, and it's the one thing you can hold on to. And you feel like if you don't have the story, you would drown in the ocean. And then, so if you come along and tell that person, they just say, why don't you give up that story? They're like, no way, I'm not giving up that story. So how do we change that with people? And this is also really important for our times right now because we're dying from the stories we tell, about the environment and money and all those kinds of things. So this is really key. Um, and one thing is we start to teach about storytelling and about the neurology of storytelling and say, actually, we perceive the world through stories. It's what organizes things through. That's how our brain works. So we do education about that. And you can tell different story. And you're something besides the story. But then the other thing is in healthcare, which I've now been in for quite a while, what I've seen, um, telling people to do something different or have a different story rarely works. You know, um, what does work is to plant a better story right next to it and water it and let it grow. So imagine out in my garden, right now, and the climate's changing, some of the plants aren't doing very well. I could try and fertilize that plant and prop it up with sticks, or I could plant a better plant that flourishes in the new climate. And within 10 years, it will displace the old one naturally. So the way I work with change now is don't worry about arguing with people, plant a better story, and then let nature make the change. The thing about when we tell a nature-based story, that's a better story. In many ways, it goes more deeper. It goes more to who we feel we are. It explains illnesses in a different way. And like I say, when you're talking, you feel like you're talking to the cells of the person, and the cells go, "Yeah, I get it. Finally, whew, that feels good." And over time, that can make the change. And the trick is, in life, we want to be like surfers or sailors catching the wind. And whenever we align with the breath of the universe or nature, we're not doing the work. It is. And the power of that is immense. So if we hook on to natural patterns and make changes to natural patterns, it's not us trying to like clamor about and convince people about this. It's nature changing something as it will. And that's hugely powerful when we get out of the way of that.
That's fantastic. Now, speaking of stories, last time we were talking about the channels and how another way of understanding them is looking at that they're actually talking about rivers and watersheds. And even this idea that I heard from you in class recently that if you look at the map that we usually use in acupuncture of the meridians, these kind of surface level invisible energy lines, they're all the same width, it's like very uniform. But when you're talking about rivers, rivers can be wide and they can be narrow and they can be meandering and they can, be gushing. And so you get the similar kind of three-dimensional experience of what's going on. But last time we left off saying that we might have a different take, or you might have a different take on what the acupuncture points are. Because really, when anyone thinks about acupuncture and what acupuncture is, they're thinking about channels and points.
Yeah. So much is lost when we boil things down to lines and points. I think in that class I mentioned, a line from Euclid, who was one of the first Greek mathematicians, and the first line of his book, The Elements, is a line is breadthless width and a point is that which has no part. Meaning that when we draw lines and points on paper, they don't actually represent something in nature. There are no lines and points in nature. That's a concept and that we use to locate things on a map or draw a triangle. But nature is actually very diverse. And like you say, a river will be one course and then it'll split into three and then it'll turn into a marshland. And then a branch will come in and that'll join all together. That's how the original vascular system was described in the Neijing with these concept of the Mai. That's the thing that really opens up Chinese medicine is when you understand that. And then, of course, you can correlate it with all the things you find in nature about rivers. We didn't talk last time about how these channels and rivers formed, and the point system is a part of that ecology. So for us now, it's a point on a line, and the line is there mainly to tell you where the points are. And the points are like a medicine. This one's good for this one's good for that. And we are doing this thing in the thought bubble where we do all the points and line them up and then hope it works, basically. But they're a part of the natural ecology. And everything that we see in the Neijing, we should be able to see out in nature. So, as I mentioned, if I can't see it in nature, I'm very suspicious of my understanding. How the channel system forms is a really interesting thing. And so for the last 22 years of Neijing research, there have been several kind of important landmark discoveries. The first one was about the blood. Oh, this is about blood. Whoa. The second one was about number and dimension of breath. The third one was about what about form? If the universe is all about patterns of motion, as we say in physics and Neijing medicine, it's mostly about things moving, not about the thing produced. Well, what's the relationship between the motions and the things? How do patterns in the cosmos turn into rivers in your body? And that took me a while to figure out. And in that, I was helped greatly by an engineer at Duke University named Adrian Bejan, who was studying entropy systems and electrical pathways in conductivity, which means the efficiency of it. And he was concerned about heat and how much heat they generate. And in the 1990s, he made this discovery that the branching patterns were the most efficient in regard to that. And he then looked at patterns of nature and said, nature's doing the same thing. And so he made this idea called constructal law, which is how nature constructs itself, which says that for a living system, a finite living system, to evolve and to thrive, it must ease the flow through it, to make the forms to ease the flow through its system of the patterns imposed on it. That means that the forms in our world form around invisible patterns, and they do so with a principle, which is to make it most easy or most efficient for the unseen patterns to move through them. And this was really like that spark really got me going. For example, if you look at a tree and you see the sun rising and falling every day and the seasons changing, and water follows those patterns, so it's rising and falling, and the tree makes passageways. The tree is actually a form. It forms around spaces that allows water to move. And it does it in a way to make it the easiest for it to move. So it's going up and down in its vascular pathway with the sun. And the tree is actually just an expression of that motion in form. And that's really where I began to understand things. So where does an acupuncture channel come from, or a river in your body? So there's the idea of the breath motions of the cosmos. They come down from the heavens. They're in the field that where nature is evolving. And things like trees form around the passage of the fluids that are moving in them. And the same is true for our body. So the rivers flow in things called graining patterns. Is this getting too geeky?
Well, I think for some people it's getting just geeky enough. Yeah, well, I think, people can choose which areas to focus in on and which ones
Wait,
to
let me put it back down to earth a little bit. So imagine, how does a river form? A river forms in something called, in the Neijing, they call a graining pattern. Or imagine that you're on a sand dune and the wind is blowing and it makes the ripples in the sand. And in the ripples of the sand, there's the banks of the ripple, but they're actually an expression of the wind that moved through the ripples. So you see the banks, but it was actually the wind that caused them. Um, so if we take the same idea with a river is actually first a riverbed, and it's a graining pattern, a graining pattern like the grains of trees. Then in the Neijing, that's called a li, Li. It means a pattern. And so if you look at how a river's made, first there's the pattern of motion, then the form forms around it, and it makes this thing called a graining pattern. And so in our body, as in nature, it's composed of graining patterns in fascia and all sorts of your tissue planes. In some of those graining patterns, blood runs, and in some, maybe interstitial fluid, or they're just graining patterns. And so the Neijing discriminates those, and and the grading patterns happen, as we mentioned, when the plant grows in vertical, as nature weaves itself on its loom. There's the vertical threads of the warp and the horizontal threads of the weft. And so as it goes up, it goes in a vertical way, which we call a Jing pattern. And then it turns out into a yin pattern, which we call Lo, or the collateral bed. And those are the graining patterns. And then in some of those, blood flows. And we know in the Neijing, because if it's a vertical pattern of blood flow, we'll call it a Jing Mai. Mai means the blood is flowing in the graining pattern. And if it's a collateral one, it'll say Lo Mai. It's just the pattern itself, it'll say Jing and Lo. Um,
I'm not
we're-
sure if this is a valid example of this or not, but it did just cross my mind. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, which, having traveled around quite a bit, has one of the most confusing road structures of any place that I've ever been. I mean, it's completely nonsensical. It's just so random and chaotic. And at one point, one road crosses on itself again at Tremont Street, and I got lost there one time. I thought I was kind of ended up falling off of the face of the universe. And I read many years later that the road system in Boston was actually uh, created on where there was all these sheep that were roaming in 16 and 1700s, that where they had just naturally found it was easiest to move. They had created these pathways. And I was like, well, that tallies. This city feels like it was planned based on where sheep decided to go. And so it's almost like that the sheep had discovered where the movement was easiest for these three hills.
that,
And that's where.
that's an idea of Dr. Bijan's idea of constructal law. Yeah.
Okay. And
Very.
I'm also curious to ask you if there's any overlap. There was a scientist in the 1970s called, I can't pronounce his name very well, Ilya Prigogine,
Mhm.
who talked about dissipative structures. So he was talking about um, how to reduce entropy by dissipating, well, something. I'm wondering if he was describing something similar.
I remember him. I'd have to go back and look at his stuff more closely. Yeah. But this was a mind-blowing thing for me. And because it's like, oh, wow, that's the key to how the world makes itself. It's about the efficiency of the patterns in them. And also, this is how Neijing science works. It's not magic. What we can say that the forms are an afterthought of the patterns that run through them. Like the sheep road is a kind of an expression of the ease of where the sheep went and so forth. Um, but uh, so that's but when the importance of the things that we see is also very important, because Neijing science is essentially looking at the things that are formed by it and reverse engineering the patterns that went through them. And that was kind of the genius of the Neijing scientists. If you look at a tree and you see that it has vascular pathways and they open and close, you can infer there's an invisible pattern of opening and closing the environment. So you can reverse engineer the world from that. So it's like this really important key that worked, and that opened up everything. and made the Neijing very consistent from soup to nuts, as we say, the beginning to end. In terms of point, what are we going to know also? They're going to be a part of natural ecology. They're not magical point, like magical channel lines. There's something that happens in nature. When the Neijing talks about acupuncture points, it uses two main terms, shui and shu. And shui is the term for a generic region where there's a cave, and shui means earth cave. It's very, the glyph and so forth looks like a cave in the earth. It means earth cavern. And what the Neijing says is that these caves are the places where the qi, or the non-tangible circulation from the rivers, floats to the surface. And what do we see in nature that like that? It's sinkholes. So sinkholes are areas that form over rivers, like in the Neijing about points, it's the same. And they form because the river that's flowing under it thins out the soil. And so the surface sinks in. And then there's also an important passageway down where the qi of the river is coming out. So also when the Neijing talks about how to find a point or a shui cavern, it says go to the depression within a depression. That means when you feel one, you'll feel this sinkhole. And then at the bottom of the sinkhole, you'll feel an opening. And that is actually an opening down to a river. And so why would we use, what's the first use of an acupuncture point, as it were? It's not to activate a point action. It's to find a pathway down to a river if you wanted to access the qi of the river. It's not where we bleed the river. But say, for example, there was an environmental pathogen like wind or cold. We wanted to take it out of the river, or now like PFAS chemicals or something. We wanted to access the river. We would find the shui, or the surface cavern, and go down and open that up, because that pathway we know is going to go right to the river. And so that's the original meaning and use of all acupuncture points. There's another category of points called shu, or sometimes called yu. There's a couple of different character versions. And that means it's a surface cavern that goes down to a river. And in addition, it does something at a distance. And so those are the two main categories. So for example, when we treat the back shu point that are down the back on the Taiyang River, those are surface caverns, first of all, that go down to a river, but they also go into organs. And so we use the back shu points when we have pathogens in organs that we want to take out. Or the other example is the root shu regions from your elbows and your knees down to your feet and ankle and hand. Those are called the bun shu or the root shu. I think they're also called the command points or the antique point. They're the ones that are fire points and metal points and so forth. And they're called bun shu. And bun means, going back to the beginning of our talk today, the root. It means a surface cavern that goes down to a river locally, but also communicates with something far away, which is the organ. And why is that? The organ is in the deepest interior, and it expresses in the deep and the farthest exterior, which is your fingers and toes and wrists and so forth. So it mirrors what's happening in your organ. So in Upper Taiyin, what's called the lung channel now, the Bunshu regions from your elbows down to your hands, they actually go right into your lung organ. And it says it in the Neijing, the lungs emerge at these points. Not the idea, the actual organ comes out there. And what do they represent? The different breathing phases of the organ: summer, spring, winter, fall. So those are so important for us because we don't see the organ directly, but we can look at the arm and create a picture of its seasonal breath pattern by looking at those regions. And then we can treat the breath phases of the lung through those regions.
I suppose it would be similar if you were a farmer or doing agriculture and you, had a, let's say, a river or stream coming through your property, and that river really started up in a mountain that was quite far away, that you might be able to understand a little bit but what was going on there by looking at the moisture in your own soil.
It could be something like that too, or I think of it sometimes as like children playing skip rope, and like you have a skip rope, and you pull it tight, and then like you pull on one end, which is way down in the organ on the end, you feel like
Mhm.
that kind of, however you think of it. Um, that's why those regions are so helpful for us, because they give us vision into the organ, but we can also then adjust that vision by treating them. There is that issue that we've gotten the order backward, which I thought we're on other podcasts about that. You know, um, that's a whole different issue, but essentially they go to the root of the organ. The other thing is about how points are named. And so when we see a name of something like Dayuan, which is now lung 9, it means great abyss. And we call these things in Neijing Nature-Based Medicine named regions, which means pay special attention because they thought it was so important to give it that they gave it a name. That
Like, they put it on the map.
right. Like if it gives you a name, it tells you "Well, this is important enough to not just say the road out of town. It's like something special. The names are universally, they're not mystical names. Sometimes today there's this idea we can penetrate the mysteries of Chinese medicine by unraveling the magic of the names. That really wasn't there. They were just saying, what does nature look like here? Like Dai Yuan is called Great Abyss because if you put your finger right where there's a bend in your wrist, that goes way, way, way in. And so they call it Great Abyss. So the idea is also that the point names are not about the points, the sinkhole, they're about the region. So that's what the region's name, Dayuan. In Dayuan, there will be a sinkhole, but you have to find it. And Dayuan is not the name of the sinkhole, it's the name of the region. So the other really important thing, we mentioned how thinking about blood changes your practice. Stop using numbers and using names completely changes your practice because you start to see the beauty of the ecological vision of the body that they were originally seeing, and it changes everything. Um,
The image that I have in my mind for these things is that a couple years ago, visited some friends in Mexico on the Yucatan side, and they had these cenotes, which I
Same.
believe. Yeah, so the cenotes are like these, I don't know if I can describe it well, but it's like the understanding is that when there was an asteroid that hit planet Earth about 65 million years ago, it hit in the Yucatan, with now Mexico, and so it created these whole, like, through the force of the impact, and now there's this underwater river system and probably water that was on that asteroid actually, because the water's a little bit different, um, that come up, and so, you can imagine, like, almost you can go swimming in them, for example, and so that's maybe another example of how this underwater system is communicating up, that you could access it that way.
Right. And it changes your practice completely. As we're teaching now in our class, when we're looking at watersheds, we do the running of the watershed, which means walking it really from beginning to end. And when you stop using the numbers and start using the names, it's this lovely, lovely experience. It's like, here's the marsh at the bend, here's the channel gully, here's the great abyss, here's the fish border. The names really make the whole thing come alive. And it says, not as if you are walking through a natural landscape of beauty and wondrous ecology. And then you're kind of noting what's wrong here. Why is the fish border dry? Maybe because the river upstream's not flowing right or whatever. It completely changes your sense of practice. And the other thing is you start to develop an eye where you see things, not a thought bubble, like this is good. You see things like, oh my God, it's not thriving here. Why? And then you do your interventions and you want to see it thriving before you're done. You see the colors change that fill up with with blood and become warm and things like that. It's a very different practice.
So very different from, choosing a bunch of points for migraine and popping
Right.
in.
And again, like when we talk about stories, is it bad that there are points for migraine? No, because, you know, those are developments of later dynasties when very experienced physicians started writing down their experience and said, when I do this, it's pretty good for migraine. And then when you look at something like what we're taught in TCM, why is it so confusing? Like this is good for malaria and hemorrhoids. What's that about? Um, it's because they went through the writings of later doctors and made a compilation of those point actions. And then when they teach them to you, they just give them to you.
Mm,
Hemorrhoids, seizures, and malaria, and you're like, what?
mm.
Doesn't make sense. You really can't hang anything on it. But originally in the Neijing point actions, there were point actions, like, for example, when you treat Dayuan, it treats the summertime breath of the lung. That is a point action. That's one of its Bunshu actions. But they were very few and far between.
And it also sounded like you, in reading and translating Neijing, found that some of the locations had moved, which I believe is also some, other scholars have found that modern scholars have found that as well, that there's certain, points that we learn in TCM, but that when you look at the original, they're actually somewhere else.
That's really true. Sometimes you'll hear this, well, the channel system doesn't correspond with the blood system because they don't overlie each other. And the fact is they did. Like we're doing upper tie-in this week in our anatomy study group. It's exactly where the brachial artery, the radial artery flows. I mean, exactly. But it got moved. So the channels got moved, the river courses got moved, and the point regions got moved. And so they don't anymore. It's a really interesting question why that happened. There was a question about that in our student forum today. Why did that happen and when did that happen? It's a little bit of a mystery. All we can say is, originally there was a very strong correlation. Everything kind of made sense by the Northern Song dynasty when they were doing the Bronze Man tests, about examinations with students finding point. It had moved and it had gone to a point-based system, and the rivers became lines, and the lines were there mostly to pass tests on where the points were. So, yeah, how did that happen? That's a whole interesting story of itself.
I think one of the things that I took from that anatomy study that I think is worth sharing because it really ties together uh, stories and things and how we see the world is that you pointed out that if you're, let's say, a med student or someone who's learning anatomy, and you learn these arteries, the subclavian artery, and then you have like brachial artery and all these arteries that's actually one river, and that the names are just referring to that section. But if you're a student or a physician and you're learning it, it the way you say it, it sounds like a different artery, that the
Uh, we were look
radial.
we were looking at upper tie-in, which is the lung channel yesterday in our anatomy class, and you're absolutely right. It comes out of the aortic arch, that starts there, and it's first the subclavian artery marked by the first rib, then it's the axillary artery, then it's the brachial artery, then it's just one river. But we just call it different things depending on, in Western medicine, depending on, is it in front of the first rib or behind it? And in the Neijing, it's all one river. It's called the Upper Tayin Bai River.
I mean, I would say that's a really profound perspective shift, because if you've only learned it with those names, you experience what it is differently because you're really categorizing that as different things, and yet it's one river. The, analogy that you gave, which is similar to how I look at it, it's like if you look at a political map versus where watersheds are, that you can have rivers that go across countries, and the river for the river is just river, it's just natural territory, but we've got these lines on a map that says, well, this is, this country and this is that country.
And that goes back to living in a thing-based world, that we understand the world through things by marking them down and measuring them and delineating, giving them a border, all that stuff. But a really important thing is, for say the Upper Taiyuan River, which is now the Lung Channel. Well, the Upper Taiyuan River is part of a whole, which means it's the river that defines a watershed. Watersheds are ecological areas defined by the flow of a primary river, like the Colorado River watershed. They have all sorts of things in nature. They have plants and animals and weather patterns and stuff in the body. They have sinews and fat storage tissue and all that stuff. And we constantly are focusing down to the thing. So yesterday in our class, we were looking at a lung river system that had a bunch of lipomas in it. And the students were asking, should we put the needles in the lipomas? And that's again how our mind focuses like the cat and the ball. You cannot stop looking at the thing, right? But the whole thing is what we want to look at. And it's an expression of breath. So when we look at the Upper Taiyuan River system, which has a root in the lung system, it's actually the breath motion of the western direction, or autumn time, or of the sunset. And we want, instead of saying elbow, brachial artery, this, that, we want to say west. And because the rule is that any aspect in that western system can impair the whole thing. And it can be anywhere. And so we always treat everything as a whole rather than a thing, even though we often work on things in the system. We're trying to treat a whole. But we have to train our mind to keep not going like the cat chasing the laser light. Take a breath and go back and saying it's about something bigger.
Wow. So very different way of looking at it, but beautiful.
It's totally transformative. Yeah. And again, it doesn't negate everything else that's come in Chinese medicine. If the same thing about root and branch, if you sign up for a TCM class today, you're like someone way out on a leaf of this really big tree. And it's like you're trying to chew on the leaf, like you're a little bug or something, trying to eat and feed there, and you don't see the rest of the tree. So you're constantly hungry and like, where do things come from? And I don't understand how it's all put together. That's starting at the branch, and that's the Western way now with the reverse time sickness. Like we look at what's the expression? If you started through, if our education just flipped and we started in the beginning, then all these things are great. The experiences of the Ming Dynasty doctors about their point action, all the different permutations that have happened. It's just part of that tree, and it all holds together really well. But you have to start at the beginning. And that's kind of the challenge we have today for our education.
So it's the catch-22 is that you'd only really know that if you'd already started at the beginning.
We get there. And it is a little sad because our training programs are long and man, if they just turn them around, you could learn about history and language and start from the beginning and learn the names instead of the numbers or with the numbers. And wow, you could hang the whole thing together.
Well, I think, more and more people are moving in this direction, so it's pretty exciting.
It is. I would say it's interesting information. I mean, sometimes you learn something and it's additive, meaning, I'm an orthopedic surgeon and I learn a new technique for, knees, and I hang it together with my whole system. This one is beautiful and inspiring and a little disruptive as it shakes at the foundation of who we are and how we understand things. And so we have to have the courage to be unsteady as we're learning and reforming things too. So it's
What
interesting. Did you feel that as a student?
uh, well, I was ready. I studied Chinese medicine and I studied functional medicine and biochemistry very deeply, and I, a couple of years ago, got to a point with both where I was ready to go through the kind of humbling and humiliating experience of being a decade into my career and just recognizing that I didn't know anything and that I wasn't really happy with what I felt like my foundations were shaky in both areas, and so went back and retrained in a number of ways. So I was ready. But one question that I'd had before that I think you spoke to, because I had looked a lot at acupuncture research, which, acupuncture research for everything that we're saying in terms of the different ways of uh, practicing or choosing treatments or understanding, in multiple clinical areas, acupuncture still outperforms, industrial medicine and pharmaceutical medicine and things like that. And I believe you had said that in many cases, it's, choosing points based on a very, accurate understanding of the sinew system. Is that fair to say?
Current practice?
Yeah, many styles of current practice, or even especially some of these microsystems like, tongue and tan and balance.
So if we look at like how an acupuncture point works in modern treatment, where we're using small needles, just activating them, why do they work? And because they do have an action for sure. It's not just a total placebo thing. That goes back to that idea of biotensegrity, that actually the body is woven. It's woven through threads, and all the threads speak to each other. And if you pull on one part of the fabric, something over on the other side changes instantaneously, by the way. And that's why, so a lot of the point-based wisdom of Chinese medicine comes from the experience that when we tug on the fabric here, it makes my ear clear. And when I tug on the fabric here, it makes my stomach open. And so there is a whole science about those tensegrity systems, but they don't include this deeper vascular
Yeah.
understanding and more comprehensive models. But we don't have to throw them out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. Anything else to add about, points and sinkholes and rivers?
I I think one thing when the students come, they love the idea of learning the names, but there are a lot of them and they get a little overwhelmed. But the good news is you can you can stop thinking about numbers, and there's a lot less of the original ones because later innovation came to look like I just gave a new point, like here's this doctor and he has a special point. And that went on, and now we have like lots of points, but originally most points weren't named and you had to know where they were, and a few were, and you can learn those, and that changes your practice into this one of ecological beauty. Yeah.
So if you're feeling lazy and like you'd like to memorize fewer names, this is the place
Thank
to
you.
start. Very cool. Well, I'm enjoying these explorations and these conversations. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Me too. It's great to spend time with you like this.
Yeah, likewise. Until the next one.
Until the next one.